So welcome to the assessment workshop. I'm going to provide a really brief overview of assessment for those who maybe haven't gone through this before, or if assessments, you want a little refresher on assessment. We wanted to start off by showing off the MCC Assessment website. If you haven't ever been there before, I encourage you to go to the instruction website, which is just instruction.morgancc.edu. And on this page, you'll find lots of different helpful materials like the handbooks and some how-tos, D2L and such. But one of the things on here is assessment. And on here, you can find the orientation that I sent out earlier this semester. I'm going to go ahead and open this to show real quick, go over some of this. Basically, assessment came out of requirements from the Higher Learning Commission, which is our regional accreditor. And assessment is a really big component. It's really picked up in the 90s and has continued to grow in terms of assessing what students' general outcomes are. By the student attending the college, what is it you hope this student is going to gain? And it has a lot of roots in general education, but we've really expanded even into career and technical education, conducting assessment across the institution. One of the things they really expect is that the institution has clearly stated outcomes, and we have those. Several years ago, the institution established these 5 common student outcomes, and the assessment committee meets regularly, looks at these a lot of times, looks at definitions, and constantly making adjustments to these outcomes in terms of how they relate to what we hope students achieve and learn while they're here. The 5 are communication, critical inquiry, information literacy, intra and interpersonal responsibility, and quantitative reasoning. And so those are the actual outcomes we then want to assess. And so it's a little bit different than grading, which is what we'll talk a little bit more about. So how we go about this is actually through the worksheet that you all may have received. Each instructor and faculty member is encouraged to provide an assessment of students on goals that relate to the material they're teaching. So if you're teaching English, you're not going to be able to assess a student in quantitative reasoning. And vice versa, if you're teaching a math course, you may not have the ability to assess their information literacy, though a lot of our math instructors actually do that one. So do understand we're not necessarily looking at every faculty and instructor can assess every outcome every year and every course. So there is some degree of flexibility with all of that. And what we do is we compile that information into an infographic to this sort that the institution can use and reflect back and say, how are we doing? And the data, because we collect at a student level, gives us the ability to really to dive in and look at different trends and patterns and assess how are our students learning these grander skills. And so all of that feeds into a continuous improvement cycle of always trying to improve our teaching, trying to improve students' outcomes. And so a lot of this you probably also do in the classroom. So one of the things that this orientation doesn't talk about, overall assessment happens at different levels. And what we're talking about here is really a high level, sort of institutional level assessment of overall outcomes. But often programs will have outcomes they expect the students. Any student who goes through this program is going to have these skills, particularly in the CTE realm, probably to pass a specific licensure or skills test. And then at the course level, you have very specific skills or knowledge you expect students to attain. So all 3 of those levels really all do fall into assessment. Here, we're just talking about that very high level of assessment at that institutional level, because that's the area accreditors, recognized institutions needed to improve the most. So I guess returning to the website, other things you can find on here, we have the assessment cycle, which is really good to be aware of. One thing we've learned a couple of years ago is trying to assess all of the outcomes at once was really a heavy load to take on. So with HLC's guidance, we did a workshop with them, and one of the things they encouraged us to do is to really break it up. And so what we ended up doing is breaking up the schedule of when we assess each of the outcomes. So you'll see right now in academic year 2020, we're currently assessing quantitative reasoning and interpersonal responsibility. And the idea of this cycle is that every year we change one outcome, but we evaluate each outcome for 2 years. So here, where we've assessed quantitative reasoning for 1 year, our hope is that faculty took their experiences, their knowledge, and what they learned from last year, and hopefully have an opportunity to see, hey, has what I've done in the last year improved? And while I'm doing that, we're also going to go ahead and assess interpersonal responsibility and see where we're at there and see if there's areas for improvement we can make. So that's why the cycle is laid out the way it is. So from there, I'm going to go ahead and jump over to the actual data collection worksheet. and explain a little bit about how do I fill this out, because that's probably the big question at hand. So I'm going to wait for this to open for just a moment. And while it does, I did want to point out that we have some directions that help walk you through the basics of how to fill this out. And so if you ever need to reference those, that I usually send out each time with the worksheet as well. But the first thing is when you open that file, you're going to, more than likely, you'll have this 2 yellow boxes at the top. The first one will ask you to enable editing. And so it'll reopen the file. We'll give it a moment here. Once that's enabled, or if you don't get that prompt, more than likely you will get this security prompt where it says macros have been disabled. If you just click enable content, then you're going to be able to use the file. Once you click enable content, what that allows you to do is to actually enter your staff ID number here. I'm going to enter a sort of test account here. So once you enter your staff ID number, you simply hit go to assessment, and you'll notice that there's now 2 different tabs that open up. So each of these tabs should relate to the current outcomes that we're trying to assess. And so the first one here you can see is quantitative reasoning. Here you will see your list of students for each of your classes. One of the common questions I get, because maybe if you teach 2 or 3 different classes, do I need to provide assessment results for all of my classes? The answer is no. Only provide assessment results for those classes where you're able to assess that outcome for that student. Another question might be is, well, I can assess the perform mathematical operations in this class, but the interpret and apply statistical info doesn't apply in this course. It's really a later course. It's perfectly okay to actually assess only one part of that outcome. We aggregate all of this together. It's really not about your course or any particular subject or class. It's really saying overall, where are our students, how are our students performing? So we'll aggregate all of it together just as much as in the other class you may be assessing a different outcome. Another common question that comes up is, well, this student dropped out or didn't complete the assignment that I'm trying to use to assess this outcome. So what should I do? Should I mark them as deficient? I would say no. If you cannot assess a student's outcome, don't assess it. Leave it blank. There's no, this isn't the equivalent of grading your course. Again, we're trying to aggregate data over the overall institution. So if you don't have a data point to provide for a student, it's perfectly okay to leave it blank, and probably better to leave it blank than submitting something that may not be accurate. And so the last part I think I always like to talk a little bit about is the fact that how assessments and grades can be very different. If you can imagine a course where you have that student who they solve their problems great, they always get it right. They have the great analytical mind, their mathematical operations, as far as that outcome goes, perfectly good. The only problem is the student has only turned in half their assignments. You know, when they do them, they get 100%, but they've only turned in half the assignments, and they're going to fail the course or they're going to get a C. That's where the grade and assessment of this outcome could be very different. We want you to assess their quantitative reasoning. On the flip side, you might have a student who does every extra credit they possibly can, pulls through with that B, but gets a lot of things right. But in terms of this outcome, they're just still a bit deficient. So grades, while grades and outcomes there might be a correlation between them a lot of times. Absolutely, they may be completely different. From that point, I've got a couple of faculty members on who've had some experience with this. I think the most challenging part then becomes, how do I assess? How do I measure a student's outcome? And I don't know if any of the faculty have any input they'd like to provide. Or
I would say it might be best then now to look at the rubric to kind of maybe drive that. Do you think?
Yep, I can. So here we have the quantitative reasoning rubric pulled up. And you can see the 2 basic skills here: perform a variety of mathematical operations, interpret, apply statistical information. That relates to these 2 columns here. And so this is a common rubric that the faculty have developed in terms of how to measure and evaluate students in a standard way. And so you can see perform a variety of mathematical operations. Basically, we have 3 levels. The student does not meet, the student meets, or the student exceeds the expectation. So does not meet means they attempt to solve problems, no or limited amount of work shown with incomplete or incorrect solutions. So that would mean that the student hasn't met what we consider the reasonable level of for that outcome. Meets, in this case, is solution is mostly correct. Work shown contains minor errors. So this is what we basically see as that minimum level we hope the students are at. But we also have an exceed so that we have that degree of spread, I guess, which is where the solution is correct, but work is shown using appropriate methods and there are no errors in the calculations. So this is, to help differentiate those students who are really exceeding the expected outcome. These are the 3 levels we are utilizing. You'll notice that we have these spaces underneath the rubrics. And so what we actually often do is ask faculty to go through and really look. And I have a couple of pieces I can send out if you really like to dig into assessment. But basically, looking at the courses you teach, ask yourself, in terms of looking at this outcome or these outcomes, should the students, by the time they complete my course, should they have mastered this outcome? If you look at it and say, you know what, I teach some of this in my class, but I don't expect they would have mastered it, we don't want to assess the students at that level because there's a good chance a lot of students may be at the does not meet. We use what's called attainment model. So we really don't evaluate students on the front end and the back end. It's very difficult with the higher education because it's not linear like secondary education often is. So in each program of study, all of these 5 outcomes hopefully have been addressed and students are able to master these basic core skills, but it may not be in every course. So it's okay, that's what I said before, it's okay to not assess some classes. If you feel the students should have been able to master this skill by this point, then it's great to provide us some feedback. That's the point. We want to know, are students reaching that point or not? And so that's what the blank spaces are for you down the bottom, is where you can actually go ahead and fill that out. What course or courses will you assess? And what we use to measure them. So, because one of the things that's really helpful is to have a very consistent measure. So you might have even a specific question that you ask on a test, that how the students respond to that question, that's the one you're going to use to assess all of the students in this outcome. And that's part, I guess, where faculty, if you have any other input.
Yeah, and I would say the emphasis in just thinking about your course, it's not necessarily creating something new, but it's trying to think of that learning outcome and how does it parallel an existing outcome within your syllabus, and then you can use, like Derek said, that one test question, essay question, or with interpersonal responsibility, a lot of times it's going to be paper presentation and the individual with the intrapersonal responsibility, and then potential group projects with the interpersonal responsibilities. So yeah, try to think of something within your course that can equate, and so that you can get that data to Derek is kind of where we're trying to get you to think. So.
At this point, had a little technical difficulty with muting my mic, but I just wanted to share real quickly that faculty data, the data that you submit is your data. I do not share that data with other faculty. I do not share it with deans or administrators. All I do is use that to compile the data at an institutional level. If you ever need your results back or would like some help analyzing any of your data for yourself, I'd be more than happy to do that, so just let me know. Otherwise, if you have any questions, if you need any assistance with this, please feel free to reach out to myself, reach out to anyone on the assessment committee, or any of the lead faculty or deans. I'm sure they'd be more than happy to help. Otherwise, have a wonderful day. Thank you for your time, and thank you for everything you do for our students at MCC.